Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Lows is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.
Proclaiming Christ, victor over sin and death. You're listening to Ancient Faith Radio, your Orthodox Internet radio connection.
This is Ancient Faith Today with Father Tom Soroka, a weekly live call-in show addressing the issues of our day from a distinctly Orthodox perspective. You can join the conversation by calling in at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Father Tom is the priest at St. Nicholas Orthodox Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and welcomes guests from across the globe to discuss important topics of interest. Here's Father Tom.
Welcome to Ancient Faith Today. This is Father Tom Soroka, and I'm so glad that you're with us this evening. We'll be taking your calls in a bit at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Matushka Trudy will be taking your calls tonight, so please make sure to turn the show volume off before you come on air. To participate online, the show is broadcast on both the AFM Facebook page and the YouTube page, and you can make comments there. You can also send us a text message to 412-206-5012. That's 412-206-5012 to send us a text or give us a call. We'd love to hear from you this evening, 1-855-AF-RADIO. So let's get started. Our topic tonight is a very serious one. In fact, I can't imagine a more difficult topic than that of suicide. And unless we think this isn't a topic that's related to us personally, let's start with some of the statistics. According to the United States Centers for Disease Control, suicide rates increased 30% between 2000 and 2018. So for comparison, each year, 700,000 people die of heart disease, 200,000 die in accidents, and almost 46,000 people succumb to suicide. That's one person every 11 minutes. And that's sobering because it means during this program tonight, 5 people will take their own lives. Suicide affects all ages. In 2020, suicide was the second leading cause of death for people ages 10 to 14 and 25 to 35. Also in 2020, an estimated 12.2 million Americans seriously thought about suicide. 3.2 million people in the United States actually planned a suicide attempt. 1.2 million people actually attempted suicide. And if 12 million adults considered ending their lives, imagine connecting that to the number of people among their family and friends that this deeply affects. This issue affects tens of millions of people, and Orthodox Christians are not immune from this tragedy. I've been a priest for 22 years, and I've experienced much over those decades. But January 6th, 2021 was by far one of the most awful days of my pastoral life, when I had to try somehow to comfort a mother and father from our parish whose son, a young man who was active in the church and active in high school, loved by his friends, he took his own life just after turning 18 years old. I wasn't prepared for anything that happened that day. and I still don't feel adequate to handle the ongoing emotional needs of the family who continue to be bewildered in grief. All I can do is listen and love them to the best of my ability. So we're here to talk about how we can all work together as a Christian family to ensure that we comfort and listen and understand and love those who are feeling so desperate that they want to end their lives. We also need to support the families of those who are dealing with people who are considering or may have attempted, or God forbid, the families of those who succumb to suicide. Because the last group carries an enormous burden and a scar on their heart. But most importantly, if you're listening to this program, either live or recorded, and you yourself are struggling with thoughts of suicide, seek out to someone that you trust. Call for help. Tell them your feelings so that you can listen and then turn away from such thoughts. So tonight we are honored to have Susan Zachariah Sanders with us tonight. She's a licensed clinical social worker. She's been providing mental health care for veteran population for 8 years. Her specialties include substance use, suicide prevention, and general outpatient mental health treatment. She has a passion for advocating for mental health resources within Orthodox parish settings, especially in ethnic parishes where the stigma of seeking care is prevalent. She currently serves as the co-chair for the Needs Assessment Working Group with the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops, the Mental Health Task Force. She attends St. Macarius the Great Orthodox Mission in Chicago, and she's also the vice president of OCAMPR, the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. And she's going to tell us more later on in the program about the upcoming conference and how those interested can participate. Susan, welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Thank you, Father Tom.
I'm so glad that you joined us. I apologize. I didn't plan that, but it's such a difficult topic. It's something that I think we don't think enough about because we think it's not going to affect us somehow. And having gone through just the little bit that I went through, of course, it's not about me, but it made me realize how unprepared I was. And so I want to talk about this to all the priests that are listening, all the families that are listening, and really everyone, because it seems like this scourge in our society needs to be dealt with in a way that is compassionate and worthy of such a serious issue. So tell us, Susan, why is the topic of suicide so important?
Well, Father Tom, I want to appreciate and acknowledge your own personal experience, not just with what occurred last year, but perhaps many times within the past 20-some years of your pastoral ministry. I think not just for clergy, but for many people, this topic is quite heavy, whether we know somebody or whether we are ourselves the individuals that struggle with suicidal thoughts or behaviors, because it's terrifying to talk about. I think the topic of suicide is important because it's terrifying enough for us to want to not admit that it occurs. And it's terrifying enough for us to not know how to navigate it. And
right.
The more difficult something is to talk about, the harder it becomes to address. And one of the things that we do know is that suicide is preventable. And so the question then becomes, well, how can we prevent it? But in order to be able to prevent it, we have to face it head on. We have to be able to have conversations like we're having today, despite how difficult it is to address.
Right, right. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. It is difficult. And now you've been working in this area for about 8 years, so or more. What are you seeing happening in society? What is the trend right now? I love that you said we have to be able to talk about this because, if you have suicidal thoughts, there's a lot of shame involved there. It's very hard to talk about. And so, what do you see happening in society? Do you see more people feeling hopeless? What does the literature say? What do the statistics say? What are you actually seeing happening right now?
So I think generally, and if we're talking about trends, I see a hopeful trend in so much that there's a lot of funding put forth in suicide prevention research. There's a lot of platforms in which information is distributed, whereas just several decades ago or even a decade ago, that was not the case. We know now that, the most effective way to prevent suicide is to provide distance between access to lethal means. It's something that seems very, very basic, very, very obvious, but being able to promote that, being able to say it so concretely and with a lot of confidence allows people that struggle with these thoughts and family members to actually take action. There's a lot of conversation about how to talk about suicide. I mean, we went from just, in certain parts of the world, we still have rhetoric in which we talk about suicide in legal manners. When we talk about somebody that dies by suicide, we may find ourselves saying somebody committed suicide. That rhetoric is left over from the times when suicide was considered illegal to take a life, including your own life. And the more we're able to stray away from language that perpetuates stigma, the more we're able to express that we're understanding this in a more complex way. So being able to say this person died by suicide, it communicates to people that it's different. There's something more there.
Thank you. I wasn't aware of that, and it is true. It's important to be very sensitive about that. And I also wanted to say, obviously both of us maybe come from ethnic families in the Orthodox faith. Of course, there is a kind of doctrinal issue here. And I don't want to shy away from that, but I want to make it very clear that in the situation that I was in with this young man, it was very interesting that the mother is from Russia and she was calling her family. And I'm horrified to say this, but I also sort of understand the mentality, not excusing it. But I think you're probably going to know what I'm going to say. And that is when she went to, or the family over in Russia went to certain priests, they said, well, we can't pray for him because he died by suicide. And I was just horrified because I understand that was a practice at one time. I understand that there was sort of not a lot of clarity around the mental state and all of the complexities regarding this, but we have to be able to get away from that. We still have to warn our people, right, of the value of life and the holiness of life, and that this is a gift from God and we have to struggle through these things. But it seemed to impose yet another burden on this mother and their family who are already incredibly burdened. So I do want to ask you, have you encountered this at all, sort of like from the doctrinal standpoint?
So or
the practical, I should say?
I don't have as much of an intimate awareness within parish communities the way you do, Father. But I will say, I grew up in an Indian Orthodox community, and it's very, very common both culturally and within Christian communities there to just deny the reality of how someone died. Perhaps for the very real reason that you just mentioned, because there tends to be consequences for how people die even after death, in terms of how people talk about it, how someone's life is remembered. And so, there are many instances where we know young people, people that are across age ranges in our community that do die by suicide, and we don't admit it. And we don't address it, and we talk, we kind of brush over the fact that someone may have died by some inexplicable manner. And what that ends up doing is it tends to isolate the family even more, because then there's a reality of how a loved one had died that seems to not be able to be accepted, or perhaps not be able to be contained by the community. So it perpetuates, like the shame just continues even afterwards.
Right. Well, let's talk about that in a little bit. We want to focus on those who are struggling with it, but I do want to talk about dealing with the aftermath within the families, and how we can help them sort of contextualize everything. So let's remind our listeners, we would love to hear from you. Give us a call at 1-855-AF-RADIO, or send us a text message to 412-206-5012. So, Susan, in your work, what are the most common conditions or risk factors or life conditions, situations that you see in which people are considering suicide? What are the common factors that we find in people that are struggling with these thoughts?
Sure. So I've been working in some population of mental health for my entirety of my career. And most recently, I currently am an outpatient manager for a substance use clinic. But before that, I was specifically, my title was a suicide prevention coordinator at the hospital that I work at. And, I continue to see veterans in my program that struggle with thoughts of suicide, as well as have recent history, and everything sort of, no matter what population I'm working in, the risk factors are the same. And so one of the strongest risk factors for suicide is a known previous suicide attempt. If there is an individual that has had a history of a suicide attempt, that is an extremely strong risk factor. Family members or knowing someone intimately, friends, parents, that's also a risk factor. Access to lethal means. This is something that we had talked about, I mentioned very briefly. Access to lethal means is a very strong risk factor as well, because depending on the lethal means access, there may not be enough time to intervene in between. So what we mean by that is, for example, when we think about firearm deaths, a lot of time we think about homicide, but what we don't talk about is that nearly 52% of firearms accounted for nearly 52% of suicide deaths. And so the reason that is because once that trigger goes off, quite literally, there is no time in between to intervene. So those are the things that we ask our veterans, when we're assessing for suicide risk, and we continue to explore further. When someone has a history, we ask about what was the means historically. When there's a family member, we take that into account, as well as other chronic mental health issues like depression and anxiety. But something that I do mention here often is that one of these risk factors doesn't necessarily mean that this person will struggle with thoughts of suicide, nor does it mean that if somebody struggles with thoughts of suicide, that they will attempt suicide. But these are risk factors to consider.
I did want to go back to one of the risk factors because I didn't quite understand it. Was it knowing someone that had died by suicide, or having someone in the family that had died by suicide? Is that what you said?
So that's a good clarification. So having a family member that has died by suicide, not just the merit of having a family member, but considering the proximity to that family member. So if it was a sibling that you grew up with, or a parent, or if there is family history, I think the thought is also that there may be other factors, whether environmental or genetics, that may play a role into how this person's environment is. So again, it's important to note that just because someone has a family member that attempted suicide, it doesn't necessarily mean that this person will. But it is a question that we ask for this reason.
One thought that actually occurred to me, a question that occurred to me, and I think maybe it's relevant. I don't know. But are there statistics in male versus female that have died by suicide?
Yes. So something that we note across the board is that it seems as though that women seem to attempt suicide at a higher rate. However, men tend to die by suicide at a higher rate. And the thought process behind this is that men tend to identify methods that tend to be more lethal. Whereas when women would attempt, they may choose methods that may provide an opportunity to interrupt the attempt in between. But yes, you're right. There is a significant enough of a difference in rate of death by suicide between men and women that's worth noting.
Okay, thank you. And one more question, and then we're going to sort of talk a little bit about the measures where we can effectively help people. And certainly I don't want to seem morbid or anything like, or even disrespectful. I was reading in preparation for our program, our discussion tonight, about the idea, especially among the young, as suicide as a kind of a contagion. In other words, that it spreads very rapidly among young people when this happens, because as you said before, now they know someone that has done this, and they see sort of the attention and so forth. Is that a thing? Is it actually possible among young people for death by suicide to be a kind of, or is there a risk of it being a kind of contagion among groups of young people?
I'm so glad that you asked that, because it was something that I was thinking about earlier this week as well. So it is a thing. A short answer is yes. What it means is that exposure to suicide or suicidal behavior, whether it's within a family, a peer group, or even media, can result in an increase in thoughts or suicide behaviors. And so behavior doesn't necessarily mean an attempt. It could be preparatory behaviors, which means going beyond thinking about it and putting some action into those thoughts, but perhaps not taking the actual step of ending one's life. So that's what we mean by preparatory behaviors. But yes, that what we see, an example of this is when Anthony Bourdain had died by suicide, and when Kate Spade had died by suicide several years ago. There was an increase in crisis line hotline calls. reporting with folks reporting increased thoughts of suicide, and that largely is impacted by the reporting behind celebrity deaths. And so if folks take a look online, there are guidance for media in terms of how to report on suicide. So again, we want to try, we want to balance not talking about suicide, because we know that doesn't work, right? And at the same time, we want to be able to talk about suicide, but be mindful of the impact of glorifying suicide. And so with media reporting, the recommendation is to be able to acknowledge that somebody died by suicide, but it should not be detailed. It should be factual and concise, and it should not provide detailed descriptions of the method that was used or anything along those lines. It should not glorify the individual that died by suicide. Good reporting should not repeat over and over again the way one died. And then also, it's important to always emphasize resources should people be struggling with these thoughts.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you so much for saying that, because I know in my own family, my 3 daughters, and our whole family, we loved watching Anthony Bourdain, although sometimes he kind of drove me crazy with the way that he approached certain things. But it was fascinating because they knew that I loved to watch those programs, and several of my kids bought me books about the life of Anthony Bourdain because they knew that I liked him. But what I think it really showed was how it affected them. And unfortunately, my daughters, who are, between 20 and 29, 21 and 29, they have grown up with a much more robust conversation around suicide. They know friends who have died by suicide, and they of course see on the television, especially many of the pop stars and so forth, who have died by suicide. And so it's fascinating how they approach the subject versus how my generation, which you aptly said, like, kind of, we don't talk about this. It's there's a kind of secrecy around it, or a shame around it. So thank you for talking about that. Let's remind our listeners again, 1-855-AF-radio. We'd love to hear from you. Maybe, unfortunately, you might have someone in your family that has died by suicide. We would love to hear from you, and just maybe about some of your thoughts or the difficulties that you've gone through, maybe what has helped you, and you could help thousands of people around the world who are listening and will listen to this program. So Susan, what are the warning signs that we should be looking for in someone that indicates that they may be themselves contemplating suicide, but before, the actual attempt? What are some signs that we might look for in people that this is happening?
Sure. So I think we can think about this in a few ways. Sometimes if we're close enough with individuals, we may be able to pick up on changes in conversation, or even pick up on the emotional state of our loved ones. So if we know that somebody is talking about certain things, talking about wanting to die, talking about this immense level of grief, or rather guilt or shame that they're carrying, or being a burden, that's oftentimes key. If they feel as though they're being a burden onto others, their logic may be, well, I don't want to put my weight, I don't want my existence to be a weight on this person that I love. Those are warning signs that we can pick up based on how someone speaks. If we note that folks are feeling hopeless or trapped, or cannot identify a reason to live. A lot of times we talk to our patients about, you have these thoughts and yet you're still here. What keeps you here? If folks can't answer that question, if they don't have a reason to keep living, that's noteworthy. Unbearable pain, whether it's physical or emotional, pain can be a reason to want to escape in a permanent way. And then the other things that are a little bit more conspicuous in so much that it's behavior that can be observed. If we note that people are making plans, for example, researching ways to die, so Googling methods to die, Googling lethal doses of medications, or looking into the mechanics of certain methods, that's something to be mindful of. If we notice increased isolation, if people are withdrawing from things that they enjoyed doing, people that they enjoyed being with, they find themselves, or if we find them saying goodbye in different ways, maybe not just verbally, but giving away prized possessions, or ensuring, reading certain clauses for insurance to make sure that family members are taken care of, drafting a will, kind of making these plans. And then, there are also maybe risky behavior that's taken that's sort of out of the norm, where they don't care about the consequences of a risk that they may take. For example, not just driving really fast, but driving really fast without a seatbelt. Any of these things in isolation may not be so alarming.
Right.
So the whole picture is something to consider. But those are examples of warning signs in conversation, noting emotions, as well as behaviors that we can observe.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. I wanted to go back to one of the risk factors that you talked about, and it's about pain. And you said whether emotional or physical. This fascinates me because obviously, in my work, and I'm sure in your work also, we deal with people who are dealing with both. I shouldn't say we deal with people. We encounter people who are dealing with maybe one or the other or both. However, I find something curious, and tell me if what you think about this. That people that are going through physical suffering tend to have maybe some sense of endurance, even if they have a terminal illness. Whereas it seems like the people that are most at risk, and I'm asking a question, so I want your correction or confirmation. The people that are at risk seem to be the ones that are going through more of just an emotional trauma, whether it be, like you said, it be shame or fear or something like that, where they don't want to face the consequences of their situation. So is it physical pain or more emotional pain that normally you're dealing with?
So I think that's a good question, and I personally, especially in my line of work, oftentimes have a hard time separating the two. And the reason I say that is, for folks that solely deal with physical pain, the resilience that we might see in that context may be because they don't have other risk factors. And so, they may have environmental protective factors where they have support at home, where they have access to medical resources, where there is hope to be seen, where they have relational support. Perhaps they don't have, a mental health diagnosis or a history of suicide attempts or family history or so. But when we do see the overlap of both, it becomes really hard to separate what pain is coming from what source, right?
I see.
And so,
okay.
And also something to consider is for folks that struggle with mental health diagnoses and conditions, if folks have not been in treatment, it's hard to know, it's hard to have insight into the illness or the condition. And if we don't have insight into how, for example, if I'm struggling with depression and the depression, it for me presents in negative self-talk, and I find myself interpreting every interaction with people in my classroom or workplace as reinforcing how negatively I view myself, that may lend itself to me isolating furthermore. And if I isolate more, perhaps I don't go to class. And if I don't go to class, I do poorly in my work. And if I do poorly in my work, then it reinforces how worthless I am. And if I am not engaged in care, I may not see that spiral. I may not have the insight into seeing how one thought can be reinforced by a behavior, and that behavior can create a new set of issues. And so that's something to be mindful of as well, where if folks struggle with mental health issues, that being in treatment can help provide insight into it, so we can kind of hit the brakes, or at least see it from a different perspective.
Good. So indeed, we are going to talk about that right now. I want to ask one last question, and this is sort of like the mythology part of it, and it maybe has to do with the prevailing attitudes that are somewhere in society, and that is, do people threaten suicide simply to get attention? And I don't mean that in a kind of callous way, but can you please address the idea if someone thinks that people threaten suicide simply to get attention?
And I appreciate you asking this, because I think a lot of times we can dismiss the reality of the dangers of suicide because we may kind of believe this in its full form. Take it to an extreme level. I would say the short answer is, I'm sure there are people that do threaten suicide simply to get attention. I've had encounters with my population before where suicide is used or expressed as a way to gain something. The difference is that when folks struggle with thoughts of suicide or behaviors of suicide, there is a desire to die. Whether that is spoken, verbalized, or not, there is an intent to die, there is a desire to die. And when folks use suicide to gain something else, the end goal is not to die, but rather to gain something else. And so we can't always tell the intent behind the expressed, whatever it might be. So a couple of things that I would probably say to folks that may encounter this from other people in their lives would be, one, to take it seriously, because we don't really know. We may not know what situations may be serious and what situations may not be. But secondly, that if somebody is using suicide, if somebody is saying, if somebody is exhibiting warning signs and is expressing acute need by expressing, desire to die, we address it head on the way we would address somebody that is actually suicidal. What I mean by that is we call 911. We don't promise that we're going to keep it a secret. And we get them the help that they need, assuming that suicide, the expressed desire to die, is real. And if that person does not want to die, their behavior may change, right? They may not respond to these efforts in the same way. But if we limit our response to this individual, this person, to, hey, your life is most important to me right now, so since you're saying these things to me, I'm calling the police, then we do our job in terms of being recipients of that information.
Good.
I hope that makes sense.
No, it made perfect sense. And actually, it goes back to when you were talking about the risk factors and so forth. And I think there is probably someone who, like you, of course, who is trained in this, would see through what is actually happening here and would get to the bottom of that. And I certainly don't mean to assert at all that any threat should not be taken seriously. So let's remind our listeners, we'd love to hear from you. 1-855-AF-RADIO. Do you have any thoughts or comments about the topic tonight? Also, if you'd like to send us a text message, send it to 412-206-5012. All right, Susan, so let's set up the situation here. We have a family member, and they're checking all the boxes that you're talking about. They are starting to, make plans. They're starting to withdraw from everybody. They're starting to give things away. Things are seeming very odd. And they're talking about they are worthless and they're a burden to everybody. And it would be better if they were just gone. And they're sort of talking around the issue. What is the most effective way to respond? Let's kind of keep it in a family for right now. What is the most effective way for family members to respond to loved ones who are exhibiting some of these signs?
Sure. So there's a few things that I'd like to know. One is to use the word suicide and ask the question directly. I think a lot of times, because going back to the beginning of this conversation, because we're sort of scared that about the word suicide, about the topic suicide, it may come out in how we talk about it with loved ones that exhibit these signs. And so the best way to address this is to directly ask the question, are you having thoughts to die by suicide? We don't want to say, are you having thoughts about wanting to be gone? We don't want to say, are you having thoughts about harming yourself? Because harming yourself can mean different things to different people in different state of mind. We want to ask people the direct question of, are you having thoughts of dying by suicide, or are you having thoughts of killing yourself? It sounds terrifying to say, but we want to be that direct. That does a couple of things. One, it gives us a direct answer back or an opportunity. And two, it tells our loved ones that we can contain that we can hold that suffering with them, because they may not want to use those words in fear of their loved ones running away, in fears of it not being, it being too scary to be held by someone else. But if we can use that rhetoric, it's an opportunity to express to that person, hey, it's scary, but I can hold this with you. So that would be one, to directly ask the question.
Good.
Two, ask the question of what method. Be mindful of access to lethal means. Like I said, one of the most effective ways to prevent suicide is to create distance between myself and the means, the method. So what that means is, if we have a firearm in the home, to make sure it's locked, to separate the key to the lock. To remove it from the home would be the best case scenario. If we have medications, to keep it in a locked cabinet, to keep it out of reach, to dispose of expired medications that are not needed. If we know that there is, there is a certain place in the house, perhaps a garage, whatever it might be, creating as much distance between the person and that access to means as possible. That's the second thing. That's very concrete, that's tangible, that's doable. If somebody is saying, right now, I'm having these thoughts, I have done these things, I have, whether it's loaded a firearm or researched ways to die, I've just done this in this moment, just a few hours ago, we again want to remove lethal access and get immediate help. What that help looks like is the hard part, right? There's a resource now where we can call the veteran, or not the veterans, but if you are a veteran, you can call the Veterans Crisis Line. If you're not a veteran, you can call the Crisis Line. And the crisis line, as many people may have heard, is as simple as dialing 988. What that number does is that you can call that number, whether you are the person that's struggling with these thoughts, or if you're a family member or a loved one, you can call that number and there will be a trained professional that answers on the other line and asks a series of questions. That number does not mean that the police will come to the house, but if that is what's clinically deemed most appropriate, that is an option. That is something that could come up. And of course, if you run into, if there's such an acute need where if you're interrupting somebody's attempt, 911 immediately. You want somebody there in the moment. If somebody's expressing active thoughts and they can't get in the car and we can't transport them to the emergency department ourselves, calling 911 so that they're there right away.
Is it common usually that people that might threaten to die by suicide would already be under some type of mental health care?
So that's a good question. In a perfect world, the answer would be yes. Unfortunately, the answer is not yes. It's no. Many people that do die by suicide have not engaged in mental health care. And perhaps that's where the missing link is, that if there are people that are engaged in care beforehand, perhaps some of these things can be discussed with them. And like we talked about, that insight could be taught. Behaviors could be considered in different ways. Different precautions can be set in place. But many people that do die by suicide may never have received mental health care or intervention.
I see. Since we are Orthodox Christians, and this is an Orthodox Christian program, of course, we want to also consider the idea that the church can be of great assistance to those who are contemplating, and of course, to the families. What role do you see the church itself playing in the care for those who are suffering from these thoughts, or from the family who have also kind of been deeply affected and maybe their lives have been changed because they've had someone that either attempted or died from suicide? Tell me a little bit about your understanding, not just from a clinical point of view, if you would please, but as an Orthodox Christian, what role does faith play in all of this? Can you give me some of those of your own thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think I'm going to put on my clinical hat for a quick second and mention that I think faith is a protective factor. Faith becomes a reason to live. And so if a faith community knows about somebody that's struggling in their parish, in their community, that can be a real healing presence. I think one of the things that we've seen in our Orthodox communities across jurisdictions in the United States in the last several years is more of an effort to have these conversations within parish walls. Even in immigrant heavy communities, these conversations are being had. And I think what that ends up happening, what that leads to, is that young people, old people, individuals that struggle with these thoughts don't have to go elsewhere to have these conversations. And that, I think, makes a really, really big difference. I was part of the mental health task force through the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops. And one of the things that we created from that task force is a list of mental health providers across the country where you can put your zip code in and find an Orthodox provider in your area and consider them as someone that perhaps one can see for mental health treatment. Or organizations, for example, like OCAMPR, one of the objectives or one of the goals is to try and get people from different professional backgrounds to come together and see how faith intersects with medicine and psychology, and consider these topics in ways that we may not traditionally think about having these conversations within parish walls. But the more opportunities like this that exist, the more it addresses the needs of the layman who may be silently struggling otherwise.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It is interesting because you're talking about the community, right? And it seems to me that when someone is feeling isolated, right, for whatever reason, this is, I think, the beauty of our Orthodox faith, especially because, we have this wonderful custom among many of our churches where we have like a coffee hour after Divine Liturgy or something like that. And it really is a kind of an experience of family, right? Our churches tend to be a little bit smaller than these, enormous mega churches or enormous Catholic churches, where people can really get to know one another. And it seems to me, Susan, tell me if this helps, and that is people feeling like they are members of this extended family of the body of Christ locally at my church, and that I have a kind of I have a family to rely on there. I have a kind of a membership there that I desire to maintain. Is there benefit in seeing and maybe even emphasizing in our parishes this kind of love for one another and love for our neighbor, even when they're parish members and maybe we don't know them, but we should get to know them?
Absolutely. I think if there's somebody that comes in and is contemplating dying by suicide, it oftentimes comes with a sense of worthlessness, a sense of not belonging, and a sense that their life probably doesn't make an impact in their existence. And so as a community, if we remember that each person that we surround ourselves with is an icon of Christ, it's hard to view anybody in any other way besides being absolutely worthy, right? Even if it was a stranger or someone random that walks into the church, if we are acting out our Orthodox beliefs, our Christian beliefs, we would see that individual as, hey, Christ is coming into this building. Let me treat him or her as such. And when we do, we're in many ways saying to that individual that you are worth my time, my effort. You are worth being here. You are seen here. You exist here. And your presence has an impact. And if your presence has an impact, then that would mean that your loss would have an impact. And all of a sudden, it becomes contradictory to the internal experiences of that individual.
Good. Yeah, that's very helpful. So you mentioned OCAMPR, and you are the vice president of the organization. You have a conference coming up in November. Can you tell us a little bit about the conference, and tell us, actually, before we go to the conference, tell our listeners what OCAMPR is all about, who is part of that organization, and then tell us a little bit about the upcoming conference.
Yes. So OCAMPR is a series of letters that basically stands for the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. So OCAMPR. And our board is made up of folks across jurisdictions, and our membership runs across Orthodox jurisdictions. And our one goal is to foster interdisciplinary dialogue and promote fellowship between people that are in the professional fields of medicine, psychology, and religion. So for anybody that may be listening, and if you're in any one of those fields and you have this interest in the intersection of psychology, medicine, and religion, look up OCAMPR. You can find us at ocampr.org. And our major event of every year is this annual conference that's coming up. So this year it will be held from November 3rd through the 5th in Chicago. It'll be held at St. Peter and Paul Greek Orthodox Church, and we have a specific theme for this year, which is Living Liturgy in Practice, Orthodox Care in Rapidly Changing World. And tickets are available. We have on the website, we have our speakers and our workshops listed out. The board and the committee, they're putting in a lot of work in making this event a success. Previous OCAMPR conferences, certain workshops, and speaker engagements have been recorded, so you can find the recordings on the website as well. So if folks want to see what it's about, you can find older recordings of it going all the way back to 2016, really. So again, anybody that's interested, I encourage folks to take a look. Registration is open, and we oftentimes get a lot of interesting topics within this larger topic of the intersection of these three different fields.
Thank you, Susan. I really appreciate that. So, Susan, a text message came in just right now, and it says this one's for me, but I want you to talk about it too. Do you have a couple of minutes just to consider this question? It says, and we kind of touched on it before, right? When an Orthodox family loses someone to suicide, why would we deny their loved one an Orthodox funeral service at a time when that family needs the healing salve of Orthodoxy more than ever? So if you don't mind, I'm going to sort of maybe start to talk about that. I think this is a wonderful question. Now, I think both Susan and I recognize that there are kind of old world mentalities regarding suicide. There's a stigma around it. And I think that the thought around it has changed greatly in the last, I would say, 30 to 40 years. For instance, in my own jurisdiction of the Orthodox Church in America, today it would be almost unheard of for that to be the case. That is, that someone would be denied an Orthodox funeral or a burial within the church. And the reason why is that it is exactly as our writer said, that we have to exercise compassion. As my bishop told me last year, he said, the family needs this as much as the person who has died by suicide needs this funeral. And so I know that it was an extremely powerful witness to the resurrection, to faith, to hope, that everyone was able to mourn together when we brought this young man into the church, and all his friends from high school who had never come to an Orthodox service before were there. And it was quite amazing. It was maybe something good that came out of this horrible tragedy. So, writer, I believe that most Orthodox jurisdictions would simply not perpetuate this idea anymore, at least in this country. I think talking with the bishops, maybe the committee that Susan and others are on, they can speak with them, and that all of our jurisdictions could speak with one voice in ensuring that our families that are dealing with this are dealt with tremendous compassion and love in allowing the burial of this person who has died by suicide. Susan, your thoughts?
I echo everything that you're saying, Father. I have yet to encounter being in an Orthodox parish where anyone is denied those sort of pastoral considerations. I think as the field, as the clinical field has a better understanding of suicide, I think the church has adapted to what we've learned, and also balances that with the necessity of the community support for the family members that are left behind as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I do want to say, however, and I don't want to kind of leave it on this note, but I am going to read something at the end of the program here. From a theological standpoint, right? We do have to recognize that the taking of one's own life, if we can speak about it in this way, it's not meant to be insensitive in any way, but it's kind of sin against God, and it's a sin against ourselves. However, when we think about sin, in a way, we as humans are sort of victims of sin in a way. That is, we're caught up in a decaying world, in a world full of sin, and therefore we can't point out one particular way of dying and say, that is not worthy of a funeral. I agree. We have to say, we have to dissuade people from a doctrinal standpoint to say the church is against the taking of one's own life, or in the case of assisted suicide. And here's the reason why. Because you are loved by God, because you are so valuable, because you have God's image in you, and therefore this is why it's wrong. However, it would be an insult to deny people a funeral because of this tragedy. That's kind of how I see that. All right, Susan, let's end with, if someone right now is contemplating suicide, what are you going to say to them right now?
I would say tell somebody. I would say call 911, or rather 988. Have a trained professional to speak with if you don't feel comfortable with speaking about this with somebody in the house. But tell somebody so you're not carrying the burden on your own.
Okay. Susan, Zechariah Sanders, thank you so much for joining us tonight. You are a wealth of information, and may God help you in this important ministry. I also hope that your conference goes very well. It's going to be in your area there. Everybody can go to OCAMPR.org, OCAMPR.org to find out more and to register. Susan, Zechariah Sanders, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before I share a few final thoughts, again, I want to offer my sincere thanks to Susan for joining us tonight. Thanks to Matushka Trudy for engineering the program, to our show production assistant, Melissa Graff, for her work behind the scenes, for everybody that listened in, and for those who will be listening. As I said at the end there, this message really right now is for Christians, but it's for everybody. God loves you. He loves you so much that he created you. He loves you so much that he died for you. And as it says in one article on the OCA website, it says, God is the source and giver of life. That life which is sustained by the Holy Spirit, that Holy Spirit who dwells within each of us. Therefore, to willfully take one's own life is to willfully cut oneself off from the source of one's life. And it's also to project a sense of hopelessness that can't be reversed even by the God that we believe in, who sent his Son into the world to precisely give us the faith and hope to see, to accept, and to share his divine love. And I want you to remember this. There is no problem, there is no crisis, there is no sin that is too great to overcome. We only need to hold fast to that hope which is, as the scripture teaches, in us by virtue of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, who abides in us and claims us as God's own Son. And that's our show for tonight. Remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday. Share out our program after that's posted. Give us your feedback and contact us with any ideas or topics that you might want to hear about. Join us next Tuesday evening for another edition of Ancient Faith Today. Good night, everybody.